I want to show you guys how we can build out a form that has some really great and helpful functionality. All of the functionality is completely being controlled with CSS. So even though this looks like it potentially could be done with JavaScript, it's completely done with CSS. So what we have is we have a form with 4 fields, and when we fill out the name field, you can see that as soon as we type in it, we're going to get some feedback that the user has entered the correct information. So you can see that we have this little check, and we also have an outline around the field when the field is in focus. So if I move on to the next field and fill out that information, I'll get the check. Now, if we go to the email address field, as soon as I start to type, you can see that I'm going to get an expanded version of the field, and it's going to be giving me a message that is letting me know how I need to fill out this field. So once I fill that field out correctly, I will get immediate verification that I've done so correctly. The password is going to work in a similar fashion. So as soon as I start to write out the information for the password, you can see that I have a message here specifying that I need to enter not only letters, but also numbers. And some of those numbers are going to need to be uppercase, and I need 8 characters. So once all of these things are successfully filled out, then I can go ahead and sign up. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna build this from scratch. I'm gonna come into Visual Studio, which is what I'm using to code this up. And we'll just start off by making an HTML document, and I'm just gonna give this a title of form. Now let's go ahead and let's build out the HTML for this. So inside the body, I'm going to be using a form tag, and we'll just set the action to a null action, as we're not going to need to do that. I always like to give my forms an ID just in case I need to hook them and style them. So I'll give that an ID of basic form. Now I'm going to be making a series of divs. The divs are going to contain the input fields, and the input fields are going to be followed by a label field. And then what we're going to do is we're going to insert a font awesome icon as well. So we'll go get that in just a moment. I'll expand this out, and I am going to be using a text input for the first field. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll add some additional attributes. So we're going to assign an ID, and the ID is going to be fname for first name. Then we're going to use the name attribute, which is also going to be set to fname. And we are going to make this field required, which will be using the HTML5 method of ensuring that the field is required. And we're going to be using a placeholder, but the placeholder isn't going to say anything. So even when we look at the form, if I refresh my form here, it looks like there's placeholder text, but this is actually the label. We've just positioned that in a way to make it look like placeholder text. So I'm going to be using just an empty placeholder. And the reason why we need this placeholder is because we're going to be using that with our CSS so that we can style this in the way that we want. I'm going to go ahead and write first name for the label, and then the for attribute of the label is going to match the ID of the input tag. And finally, I'm going to be using a font awesome icon. I'm going to be using this little check right here. So I'm going to copy the HTML and I'll incorporate that into my document. Now, in order to take advantage of font awesome, I'm going to also need to point to the font awesome CDN. So I already have the information that I need right here. I'm just going to copy this, and up here in my head section, I'll make a link tag and I'll link out to the font awesome CDN. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to go ahead and link to a empty CSS file that I'm going to be using to create all of my CSS. So now the input tag is set up in the way that I want. I'm just going to copy this div and we'll paste this in, and we're just going to change this information to be the next form item, which is going to be our last name. It'll have all the same attributes. We're just going to change the values, and we'll change what the text says right here. So if we save this page and we preview this in our browser, this is what the form looks like so far. So it's not too exciting because we haven't added any of our CSS, but let's get the HTML done first, and then we can move on to the CSS. The next field that we're going to need to incorporate is going to be our email field. So for this field, the type on the input is going to be set to email, and the ID will be email. The name is going to be email. Again, I do want this to be required. We'll have our null placeholder. We'll change the for attribute on the label, and we'll change the actual text to say email address. And in addition to having the Font Awesome icon, we're going to also add another div. This is going to have a class of message, and this div is going to contain the message that we want to deliver in case the user has not entered the information in the way that we want them to. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a little message here that says must be a valid email address, and this is the format that I'm looking for right here. I'll go ahead and I'm going to copy this div right here, and we'll paste this in. This is going to be the last field that we need for this form. This is going to be the password field, so I'm going to set the type to password, and we will go ahead and specify that the ID and the name are going to be set to password. We're going to go ahead and we'll specify the for attribute on the label to be password, and the text is going to say password as well. Now, in addition to this information, I'm going to add one more attribute, and that is going to be the pattern attribute. So the pattern attribute is available in HTML5, and it's going to allow us to go ahead and put some sort of restrictions or rules in how we are hoping to collect the information. So in this first set of parentheses, what I'm doing is I'm saying that what I'm hoping to collect is going to be any character as long as it's a digit. So I'm using the wildcard selector here, and I am specifying that I want to be getting a digit. Okay, so that's going to take care of the number because we want our password to have at least one number, one uppercase and one lowercase. In the next set of parentheses, I'm going to specify that I want to have any character A through Z, and this is going to be capital letter. So I'm going to go ahead and collect that. And then we'll do the same thing for lowercase letters. So I'll open up my parentheses once again, and we'll put question mark equals. And then we're going to go ahead and put dot, asterisk, and in the square braces we'll put lowercase a through Z. So this will get our lowercase letters. And then the final element that I want to add to the pattern is the fact that I want to have 8 or more numbers in there. So we'll go ahead and put 8 inside the curly braces with a comma like so. And let's just change the message here. So our message is going to specify that the password has to be 8 characters, and it needs to contain 1 uppercase and 1 lowercase and 1 number. All right, and then finally what I'll do is before the form tag closes, we're just going to make one more input element. And this input element is going to be our submit button. So I'll set the type to submit. And because I want the text to say something other than submit, I'm going to go ahead and assign the value to be sign up. So we will save this. And if we go ahead and look in the browser, this is what it looks like. In the password field, if I just put 123 and I try to sign up, well, first of all, it's going to ask for some additional information. So I'll just go ahead and enter that. And if we go ahead and sign up, it's going to say, please match the requested format. So if I say ABC, it still is not going to validate. And now I have 6 characters. If I add some more letters, you can see that if I go ahead and sign up, it's still not validating because I haven't entered any uppercase. So as soon as I do an uppercase and I click sign up, then the form goes through. So our HTML is done. Now we're going to move on to the CSS, and the CSS is really where all the magic of this particular example is going to reside. So I'm going to go into my base.css, which is an empty file, and I'll just add some basic rules here on the body. I'm going to make a rule on the form, and we're going to set the max width to 500 pixels. And then we'll just use margin of 0 and auto so that that stays centered on our page. I'm going to target any divs that are children of the form, and we're going to go ahead and set their position to relative. We're going to set the background color of these items to white. And we'll go ahead and assign a border on the bottom as well. So this is going to be solid, 1 pixel, and we'll use CCC for the color. Now I'm going to go ahead and make a rule for my label element. The label is going to have a position of absolute. This is going to allow us to position the label. So instead of sitting next to the input fields, this is going to allow us to position these within the input field. So I'm going to set the top to 20 pixels and we'll set the left to 20 pixels. And let's go ahead and set the font weight to bold. And finally, I'm just going to reduce the opacity down to about 40%. So if we save this, you can see that right now everything's a huge mess, okay? So we will adjust this in just a moment. I'm going to make a rule for all of the input fields. I'm using the attribute selector for type, for text, email, and password. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to set the background color of these items. And we're just going to use a really light gray. We'll set the text color to be a dark gray. I'm going to increase the font size, and let's use 1.5 ems. I'm going to be removing the borders, so I'll set the border to 0. We're going to add some padding so we have some room around the edges. We're going to be using 15 pixels for the top, 20 pixels for the right, 15 for the bottom, and 45 pixels for the left. And then finally, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to specify the width. So I'm going to use the calc value right here, and we're going to say that we want the width to be 100% minus, and what we'll do here is we'll minus 65 pixels, which is the current value of the right and the left pixels. So that's just going to allow our input fields to take up this entire width, and you can see how the label is now sitting within the input field. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a rule for my font awesome icon. And since all of my icons are the exact same class, I'm just going to go ahead and use this real specific selector. And we're going to position these things absolute. We're going to specify top is going to be about 35%. Left is going to be 15 pixels. My font size is going to be 1.5 ems. And we're going to make the color a light teal. So here's the hex value for that. So if I save this right now, you can see that this is what the Font Awesome icons are going to look like. Actually, I think our top value maybe is a little low, so let's change that to 25. That looks a little bit better just so everything's aligned. And then finally, I'm going to go ahead and just hide these. I don't want them to show by default, so I'm going to turn the opacity to 0. All right, let's make a rule for our message. So we are going to set the color of the message to be a red color. I'm going to set my font style to italic, and we'll set some padding on the message. So 0 for the top, 30 pixels for the right, 0 for the bottom, and 50 pixels for the left. So if we save that, you can see we're formatting this message right here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and specify that the max height be set to 0. And when I do that, that is going to kind of, change the position of where these are and kind of collapse them. That's fine. We're going to use transition of 0.25 seconds and an overflow of hidden which is simply going to hide these from view. So we don't want the message to show up unless it is needed. So we will be doing that with some of our CSS as well. And let's go ahead and just style our sign up or our submit button. So I'm just going to use my attribute selector again, and we'll have this display as a block level element. We'll set some margin on the top and the bottom of 20 pixels, right and left of 0. We're going to set the color of this, and I'm just going to plug in a hex value for that. We'll change the font color, and I'm going to say that the border is going to be 0. We're going to set some padding all the way around. We'll set our font size to be a little bit bigger. And finally, we're going to set our width to be 100%. So that is just going to ensure that the button is going to take up the entire thing. Now, I missed putting background color, so let's add that in. All right, so there is our sign up button. So that is all squared away as well. So now we're going to get into some kind of trickier selectors so that we can control some of the other features or elements that are on the page. I'm going to kind of come back up here where I had my attribute selectors, and we're just going to copy these, and I'll just plug this next rule in right underneath. We're going to go ahead and we're going to set attribute selectors for all of these inputs, but we're going to be using the pseudo class of focus. So focus is what the field looks like when the user actually clicks in the field. So you can see I have like this kind of blue, fuzzy blue border that's appearing. So we're going to style that. So we're going to be using colors that are going to go with the look and the feel of what we're using on our form. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the outline to 0, and we'll go ahead and we'll set the background color to white. So if I save this, you can see now when I click in these fields, there is no default focus state. We've kind of overwritten that with what we want to do right here. The next thing we're going to do is when we click inside one of these fields, we actually want the label to disappear. So we could accomplish that with some JavaScript, but for our purposes here, we can also accomplish it with just straight CSS. So I'm going to use the same selector of the input with the focus, and then I'm going to say plus label. So when we say plus label, this is specifying that this is a sibling of the first item. So if we look in our HTML, you can see that we have our input field, and that's immediately followed by the label. So this selector is going to allow us to control this. And all we're going to do is we're just going to take the opacity and turn it to 0. So when I click in these fields, the label is going to disappear, which is what we want. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to style how we want these input fields to look when they are valid. So I'm going to use my pseudo class selector of :valid. And I'll do that for all 3 of these. And let's open up our curly braces, and we're going to go ahead and we're just going to set a margin of 4 pixels, and we're going to set a box shadow, and our box shadow is going to be 0, 0, 10 pixels, and then I'm going to use a RGBA value. That's going to be 0, 188, 212, and 0.8. So when we go ahead and click in one of these fields and we enter something that is valid, you can see that we're getting our teal colored border. So you can see that right now when I enter something into the field is a little bit too long. That's because we're adding 8 pixels of margin on the right and the left. So let's just set our width when the field is valid to be slightly smaller. So that should take care of it. And now when I click in this field, the value is correct. And when there's nothing in the field, it should still look good. So that looks good to me. Now currently, when I click away from the field, you can see that the label is still showing up. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make sure that we hide the label when the user has entered something into that field. So we're going to go ahead and we'll just use this same selector right here. and we're going to just add on plus label. I am again going to be using my adjacent sibling combinator selector, which combines two sequences of simple selectors that have the same parent. The second one needs to come immediately after the first one, which is going to be true in our case. And all we're going to do here is just set our opacity to 0, which is going to hide that. So you can see how the label goes away when I've entered something into that field, which is what we want to have happen. So that looks pretty good. The next thing that we want to have happen is when the user has successfully entered the information that we're expecting, we want to display our little Font Awesome icon. So once again, I'm going to use the same initial selector, the input with a pseudo class of valid, but then this time we're going to use the general sibling combinator, which is similar to the adjacent sibling combinator. We create this with the little tilde, and then we're going to go ahead and add the class for our Font Awesome icon right here. And I'm just going to copy this so I don't have to type that out again. And we'll go ahead and add that to all of these. So just keep in mind when you use the adjacent sibling combinator, the difference is that the second selector does not have to immediately follow the first one. It is simply going to select all elements that are preceded by the former selector, which is going to work for us here. So all we have to do is just set our opacity to 1, and you can see that it's going to bring our Font Awesome icon back into play. And now that I've added some additional margin and whatnot, I think I need to just adjust the position back to maybe like 35 because it was a little high before. So that looks great. All right, so this is coming together really well. It's going to work great for our first name and last name fields. For our email address field, what I want to specify here is my message. And it looks like our label is not disappearing. So let's just really quickly make sure that we have everything spelled correctly here. Oh, actually the label is not disappearing yet because this is our selector is only going to make it disappear if the selection is valid. We haven't addressed what's going to happen if it's invalid. So let's actually do that real quickly first. I'm going to go ahead and I'll just go back to my kind of base input types, and let's copy this, and we'll just put this right, let's just put it after our icon. And so what we're going to do to alter these selectors here, I want to style the input if the field is not valid and not focused. So currently when the field is focused, it looks fine, right? I can continue to type and everything looks okay. But as soon as I click away from that field, that's where we're having issues. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a selector that is going to allow us to target the field if it's not valid and not focused. So we will use, after the initial part of our selector, :invalid, which will get it if it's not valid. Then we're going to use :not, and then in parentheses we're going to say focus. And then we're going to string in another not, and then in parentheses we're going to say placeholder -shown, and that is going to be the selector that we're going to use for this. So the placeholder shown pseudo class is going to select the input element itself when the placeholder text exists in a form input. So what we're doing here is we're selecting it if this is not the case. Not placeholder shown is indicating that the input is not empty. So rather than having to type that again, I'm just going to copy this and we'll just paste this into the other selectors that we have. Perfect. And then we're going to specify the background color. And for the background color, we're just going to kind of set it to a really light shade of red. It'll almost look kind of pink. because we're just going to use like 20%. And I'm going to add some padding on the right as well. And then in order to be able to see this red color, we're going to need to hide the label. So I'm going to use my same selector, except we're going to go ahead and we're going to add on plus label. So again, we're going to go ahead and get a sibling that is a label. And we'll just set the opacity to 0. And now let's go ahead and add what we want to have happen to the message. So again, I'm going to use the same selector. We'll just copy this up here. And I really hope I don't have any kind of mistakes in my spelling, or you will find them, I suppose. And let's go ahead and let's change our selector. So we're going to be using invalid focus, not placeholder shown. And then we're going to say tilde.msg, and then for the rule right here, we're going to give this a max height of 200 pixels, and we're going to add some padding. We'll use 0 for the top, 30 pixels for the right, 20 pixels for the bottom, and 50 pixels for the left. And it looks like I actually put a hash value in front of my RGBA, so let me get rid of that. That's looking much better. So you can see in my form, if I've filled out the field correctly, I get the checkbox that's been verified. If I go ahead and I fill out something that has not been verified, it's going to show up with a pink background, indicating that there is some sort of error there. In addition, we want to show our message. So the message is not showing up yet. Let's go ahead and let's see if we can get that to display correctly. And actually my selector for the input field is not quite correct here. I have an extra set of parentheses around focus, which should not be there. Our selector in this case should be if it's invalid and focus and the placeholder shown is not showing, and it has a adjacent sibling combinator of message. So let's just adjust this on the rest of these so this is set up correctly. So as soon as I click in this field and I start to type something, as long as it doesn't meet the criteria, we're going to see the message that this has to be a valid email address. And as soon as I populate that correctly, it will show as corrected and our message will disappear. So when I come to my password, if I just type some numbers, it's going to open up and let me know, hey, you got to do lowercase numbers, uppercase numbers, and it has to be at least 8 characters. So as you can see, we have quite a bit of pseudo class selectors that we're using in this example. This is a really handy feature to be able to incorporate into our forms. Our forms are going to give the user some much needed feedback and let them know when they're doing things correctly, and when they're not doing something correctly, we're going to give them a message that is going to appear right away. This validation is actually client side. We don't have to send anything to the server. Nothing has to be processed. They're immediately going to know if they're doing something right or not, which is great for our end user.